My name is Michael Gall. I'm the president of the Archaeological Society of New Jersey. I'm also a principal senior archaeologist at Richard Government Associates. The paper title is The Coopers, Freedom, Abduction, and Life in Central Delaware from the 1770s to the 1820s. I'd like to start off by recognizing that I'm a white man who is interpreting a site that was occupied by an 18th century Black family. Certainly my background influences my site interpretations and aspects of the site that I've chosen to speak about today. It is also without question that individuals of African, Asian, Latinx, or Native American descent could and probably would individually view and interpret this site through the lens of their own cultural experiences, and that those interpretations may differ from one another. As archaeologists, we are often given opportunities to re-explore collections from excavated sites, and I hope that my interpretations are not the last, and that one day the site is re-examined and interpreted by others. Archaeologically, we all benefit when collections are re-examined as new ideas, data, and viewpoints are brought to the table. And with that said, I'd like to introduce a site. In 1820, Richard Cooper, an enslaved Barbadian of African descent, died a free Quaker at age 82 on his farmstead in Little Creek Hundred, which is now Dover, in Kent County, Delaware. His occupation of the farmstead began in the 1770s with his beloved companion Nanny, after the two were released from bondage by the Quaker Hanson family. Nearly 200 years after Richard's death, Cooper family members' lives were brought to the foreground in 2012 when a small scatter of broken ceramics was found at the back end of a farm field just over 1/2 mile from the nearest road. The scatter was designated as Locust B of the Garrison Energy Site. We found the site prior to the construction of a natural gas energy generation plant. Like other federal period families, the Coopers struggled through a milieu of white hegemony and structural racism as they attempted to transition from enslavement to freedom beginning in the 1770s. An experience shared by others, this struggle shaped Black lives, communities, and society in the Northeast, and its contextualization does as much for informing our understanding of past lives as it does for those of present-day communities. Archaeological remains and historic documents surrounding the Coopers broadens our perspective of life for the family and also provides nuance for understanding the Coopers' heartfelt story of human endurance and struggle, captivity and manumission, success and loss, faith, and the way that freedom was harshly qualified for Black families in federal period Delaware, just as it is across the nation today. The historical documents surrounding the Coopers illuminate the power and inequalities that existed in Delaware and its structural manipulation by white society in order for whites to obtain the quote-unquote American dream. Documents highlight African Americans' development of social, economic, and religious support networks as they attempted to lessen the effects of racial violence, discrimination, oppression, and segregation in their lives. For one family member, Richard and Annie's son, Aaron, court records also underscore the vulnerability of Black men's bodies to public and institutionalized white aggression, an unmitigated issue that continues to affect Black Americans' daily lives. Recovered artifacts from the site also provide a texture and a tangible proximity with which to personalize Cooper family members' daily home life. Activities left behind serve as a lens through which to understand some of the actions family members took as they rightfully staked their own claim in America's development and sought to regain a sense of stolen personhood. Collectively, historic and archaeological data reveal a complexity and rich diversity among free Black households and communities in Delaware. This complexity was born from individuals brutally taken from various cultural groups across West Central Africa and oppressively forced to labor together on American and Caribbean plantations, resulting in merged, altered, and reinvented traditions and practices that changed over time and place. The Coopers were just one of thousands of Black families in early Delaware who experienced this brutality and were eventually released from bondage in the 1770s. Their circumstances were shared across the landscape as former captives bought their own freedom, escaped bondage, or were released from captivity by enslavers. Freedom, however, came with a cost that was realized daily. In federal period Delaware, Black individuals and households had varied experiences with and responses to racialized limitations of the freedom while being cast as other. Some families found success, while many others struggled with generational poverty and denial of wealth-building opportunities. Focus on the Cooper family here provides us with an ability to explore the ways that just one family experienced and navigated a racialized landscape with cultural expressions, racialized landscape, and navigated a racialized landscape along with cultural expressions. Focus is not on success or failure, but rather on the gray areas in between. Richard and Annie Cooper were captive laborers until the 1770s, when the Hanson family, having been removed from the Quaker meeting, finally conceded to manumit its enslaved workforce in order to be welcomed back into the Society of Friends. The Coopers were not released wholesale. The couple's 7 children, Celia, Hannah, Israel, Daniel, Charles, Barbara, and Aaron, were given their freedom piecemeal over a period of 13 years, stretching from 1779 to 1792. This cruel and delayed release from bondage certainly had devastating impacts. For one, Richard and Annie were forced to keep ties with their former captors, and they were also robbed of the opportunity to form a nucleated household with their own children, a privilege enjoyed by so many white families. Of the Cooper family members, documents are most robust for Richard and Aaron Cooper's lives. This is not to say that others, like Nanny, were less important. We just lack documents to tell their stories in a singular way. And I should also note that even though we have documents that relate to Richard and Aaron, we don't have their voice in any of the documents. It's always told by a white individual in the community. So even at that, we're lacking. Born to enslaved parents in Barbados around 1736, Richard was savagely taken from his family and transported to the Southeast American colonies at age 12 or 14. He was ultimately purchased by the Quaker Hanson family to labor on its central Delaware plantation in Camden near Dover. Nanny's birthplace and parentage were not recorded. Following manumission, the Hansons established the Coopers at the back end of a swampy outparcel known as White Oak Swamp Farm and gave them life rights to a small parcel of cripple land, that is land that's not well suited for agriculture, but you can use it for animal husbandry. But this land was a meager pittance of their freedom dues. Others undoubtedly received less. Sometimes it was in the form of clothing, sometimes it was in the form of money. With little support or funding, the Coopers soon set about constructing what became a bustling farmstead in the years to come. Nanny earned income by performing outwork, possibly including laundering and mending clothing. She also likely tended the garden and sold or bartered vegetables from her work. Richard may have worked as a barrel cooper, as suggested by his surname, and he also operated the farmstead. Using their crippled land to their advantage, the couple chose to concentrate in animal husbandry, owning a large stock of pigs, sheep, and some milk cows. By the 1790s, the Coopers were among nearly 4,000 Black residents in Delaware who lived as free men and women, yet slavery continued in the state until 1865. In fact, north of the Mason-Dixon line, Delaware is the only state to have never forcefully either abolished slavery wholesale or instituted a gradual Emancipation Act. So it's a bit different from the rest, and it largely had ties to more southern states like Virginia and Maryland. Near the Coopers' farmstead grew an enclave of other Black households, including some of their own children, like Daniel and Charles. Here I'm showing an 1800 census of this enclave that resided near Richard Cooper's house. It included Charles and Daniel Cooper, John Finney, Timothy Tan, Joseph Fisher, John Davis, Cato, and Benjamin White, as well as a man named Mingo. This small enclave and others throughout Delaware and New Jersey developed as a means of protection against white racial violence, as well as a support network. Residents on Hanson's outparcel allowed the Coopers to have their freedom easily qualified against accusations of slave desertion. This, along with ties Richard had made with the local Quaker community, proved essential when his youngest son, Aaron, a free man at the time and aged 40, was abducted in the middle of a May night in 1811 by 5 armed white men, tied, bound, and smuggled to Natchez, Mississippi, where he was enslaved on a cotton plantation for 3 years. A vigilance committee quickly formed to regain Aaron's freedom. Aaron, who filed suit against his captor, eventually returned to his wife Hetty and his 3 daughters in Delaware after a court ordered his release. None of his family or Aaron himself were able to testify in his own defense due to Delaware and Mississippi laws at the time. Through years of hard work, Richard became a respected elder in the local community, due in part to his relative success, as well as his strong faith. From 1800 to 1820, the Coopers amassed enough wealth, largely tied up in livestock ownership, to rank in the top 14% of the town's Black population and 52% of the entire town as a whole. And this is based on tax ratables, so it has no indication about their actual ability to gain wealth, but rather on the items that they own that could be taxed. In 1800, the family suffered a devastating loss when Nanny was fatally injured during a horse-drawn cart accident. That year, at age 65, Richard requested admission into the Society of Friends. His request was likely urged by Mary Hansen, with whom Richard is claimed to have developed a positive relationship with later in life. And this is coming from Mary Hansen's daughter, which is documented in Richard's obituary, but this is not stated by Richard himself. This request was met, and 3 friends, that is Quakers, were appointed to examine Richard's lifestyle and home to ensure that he was satisfactorily living as a Quaker. Unlike other African Americans who shunned Quakerism in preference of Methodism and Baptist beliefs, Richard adhered to its guiding principles, though evidence suggests that he didn't adhere to them singularly. He gained membership in March of 1805 and became among the earliest Black Americans to be admitted into the society, largely due to discrimination amongst Quakers themselves towards Black residents and other Black individuals who wished to become Quakers, which were notably few, actually. In 1820, Richard Cooper passed away. His farmstead was soon plowed over, and public memory of the Cooper home faded with time. In memorial to their fellow Quaker, the local meeting published a lengthy obituary, exalting Richard's esteemed character. This obituary also likely served an alternative purpose, and it was that for the abolition movement, as it was reprinted 11 years later in its entirety. In part, the obituary read, "By the people of color in his neighborhood, who was consulted in most matters of controversy in which they were interested, and his good counsel always tended to, and often effected an amicable adjustment of differences. He appeared generally concerned to promote friendship and brotherly love, and in his friendly visits, he mostly had a word of religious exhortation." Nearly 200 years later, the Coopers' lives were once again brought to the foreground. So what did we do archaeologically to explore the Cooper family and their everyday lives? Well, we needed to use an assortment of techniques at the site, largely because it became very clear early on in initial surveys that the site was going to be difficult to define, largely because of the paucity of artifacts that were found. So this is a site map. It shows the site boundary in this bold, dark line. The square and rectangular, less defined or not unbold shapes are excavation strip blocks where we mechanically removed topsoil after earlier excavations. And these were done in order to help identify buried cultural features. So the layout is we have the house here in the central area. We have a hearth in the northern portion and a hearth in the southwestern corner. The house likely faced southwest, which is unusual for the time. We also had a well in the side yard. We had either an outdoor cooking stand or a fat rendering area where we had 2 posts that bisected or flanked a central cooking area. We had a large burned area here, identified by a magnetometer anomaly, and this may have been another cooking area that just left no physical traces in the ground. We had multiple outbuildings. We had an outbuilding 1, outbuilding 2, the function of which were unclear. A large barn built with posts and ground architecture. A building interpreted as a possible smokehouse, and this interpretation is made because of a magnetometer anomaly that suggested that the area had burned soil, as well as a large rectangular shaped storehouse. And this is the only building on the property that had a cellar. We had 2 sub-floor pits below the house, but these were fairly shallow in size. We dug 44 60-centimeter diameter test pits on a grid and 22 1-meter square units. We completed 3 different surface walkovers of the plowed field in order to locate, map, and collect artifacts. We also collected 522 closely spaced soil samples for soil chemical analysis. And this was done in order to look at the distribution of soil element data to determine how the Cooper's land use altered the soil chemistry at the site. And at this map, I know it looks a little wonky, but each of these yellow circles are the soil samples that we took. The areas in very dark black are areas where we had higher concentrations of, in this particular instance, it's phosphorus, where we had higher concentrations of phosphorus. The areas that are in lighter color are areas where those densities were much, much lower. I'll show you aluminum in a second. It looked as though, based on our examination of the soil chemistry data, we were able to identify different yard activity areas, and the soil element data really corresponded with the location of former buildings at the site. So in most cases, all areas that had a lower density of element concentrations are the areas where we had buildings. And this may have been because of the ways the Coopers used the yard. We think it was largely because of yard sweeping activities that were conducted. And here's another map of aluminum. Similar thing, the central area is very light. We have a barn in the corner that's also very low density. The areas peripheral to these are areas where we have much higher concentrations of these elements. So the soil chemistry that we did was extremely useful in pinpointing former building locations. Geophysicist Tim Horsley completed ground penetrating radar as well as a magnetometer survey to help locate buried anomalies that may mark buried cultural features like wells and cellars. Smaller features, however, like post stains from decayed posts, did not produce any geophysical anomalies. So I know this image looks like the surface of the moon, but it's a magnetometer survey and it reflects differences in the magnetic anomalies at the site. So in this area, we have the location of the well. It's marked because there's this great disturbance in the soil, but we also had a very large piece of iron, a fireback, cast iron fireback that I'll show you in a second. Was recovered from the base of the well. That building that we interpret to be a smokehouse is located here, and we think this anomaly is caused by burning of the soil, which changes the magnetic polarity of the soil particles. The storehouse is this very light gray shaded area, and the house stood here. We also had some soil burning in this area. Unfortunately, when we conducted the magnetometer survey, we didn't realize that during the first survey, our pin flags had been accidentally left within the plowed field. And that's what's reflected by these white and black dots. So a note to researchers, definitely remove pin flags from agricultural fields or sites if you're planning on doing a magnetometer survey, because it's going to cloud your data. Here's an image of the combined geophysical survey data. We have magnetometer and GPR data combined here. And a lot of these anomalies do correspond with either cultural features that we identified, activity areas, or former building locations. Lastly, we removed over 8,000 square feet of topsoil in 20 areas of the site with a backhoe. And this was done in order to expose cultural features. All told, we sampled 30% of the farmstead core, which measured about 175 feet by about 240 feet in plan. We identified just 47 cultural features and recovered slightly more than 4,000 artifacts. These findings were notably meager, actually, given the extent of excavation and duration of occupation. But the results did tell us a lot. In fact, I've worked on many other sites that are the same time period, and even at a 10% or 15% site sample, you're going to get upwards of 20 to 35,000 artifacts. And those are sites, farmsteads that are occupied by sort of middling to wealthier white landowners. So there's definitely a difference in terms of the artifact densities at this site compared to other sites. But we do have evidence of African-American occupation in Delaware, tenant occupation in Delaware, where we also have very low artifact densities at the sites. The paucity of artifacts may speak to the Coopers' purchase power, their active frugality, disposal and yard cleaning activities, and the types of items used and discarded. Based on the data, we're able to locate several buildings that are shown here, as well as activity areas. These included a home shown in the center in this area. We also had a well, what we interpreted to be a possible chicken coop, which rested on several post holes. We have this area that could have been an outdoor cooking area, a barbecue pit, or maybe a fat rendering area if meat was hung over the fire. A burned area, perhaps it's a location where Richard engaged in barrel manufacture. The house itself consisted of two parts, and each part had a wooden constructed chimney stack. We have the two outbuildings here, a barn, the interpreted smokehouse, as well as the storage building or the storehouse in the back. The render is based on the archaeological data that we had from the site. It's very, very likely that there were other enclosed portions of the site for paddocking animals that we just don't have data for. It was probably a worm fence or something like that just didn't leave any posts in the ground. Edward Gonzalez Tennant created the interpretive render, which you can see here, of the farmstead that was based on the archaeological data that we had. The ample building stock was necessary to maintain, shelter, and process the quantity of livestock the family owned. The spaces in and around the home served as a backdrop for Cooper family members' daily life. There, they socialized, worked, cooked, laundered clothing, and likely entertained. Soil chemistry also confirmed the presence of these different yard areas, some of which were likely swept clean, resulting in few artifacts within the site area. A tradition common among poor white working class families, as well as some black families. In here, not to complicate the discussion, but we did a discriminant function analysis based on the data. So based on where every single one of those 522 soil samples were taken, we assigned our interpretation of where they were on the site. So we had off-site samples. We segregated the yard into different areas. We had a west yard. We had the interactive yard, which is the area that immediately surrounded the house on all sides. And then we had a peripheral yard where we had the larger buildings. And as you can see by this plot, the off-site samples were definitely different than all of the on-site samples, which definitely means that the Coopers affected the soil chemistry at the site. We also can see that the peripheral yard, where the barn, the two outbuildings, the storehouse, and the smokehouse were located, mapped very differently than the interactive yard, which are a separate cluster of information. Those are the black squares on this map. So we learned a lot about the family and their choices from the evidence of the buildings. Richard and Nanny refrained from erecting their buildings on stone or brick foundations, possibly reflecting a level of thrift and know-how, allowing the family to divert funds toward livestock and other necessities. Dark soil stains from decayed wood reveal the entire farmstead was constructed using earth-fast methods. This included buildings set on structural posts placed in holes or on driven posts, wooden sills placed in narrow trenches, a storehouse or cellar that was lined, that had a cellar that was lined with wood to keep the earthen walls at bay, as well as a well that was built of squared wood frame. So in this picture I have in the upper left is the cold cellar. This is just a quarter excavation of it. We later excavated another quarter to have a full bisect. The bottom right is this outdoor hearth or cooking area. We can see two driven posts that flank this square area in the center where we had charcoal residue. And here are pictures of the excavation of the well. This is a partial excavation here to the left where we bisected the upper portion. And you can see the stain left by the wooden frame. The image to the right is a later, more robust excavation of the well until we hit the water table. And within that water table, we had some very large artifacts, including this wooden pail that the Coopers used to retrieve their water from the well. We also had a large cast iron fireback that would have been placed in a chimney. I'll show you a picture of that in a second. We had a very large piece of what we think is Barbadian coarse earthenware or Colonoware from the bottom of the well, as well as some large broken glass bottle fragments. So here we can see the use of the earth-fast architecture site-wide as a less expensive, expeditious alternative to masonry foundations that allowed Richard and Nanny to forego expensive mason costs. During this time, few property owners built their homes with earth-fast methods, but tenants, however, continued to do so into the late 18th century, particularly in the inner and outer coastal plain of Delaware and New Jersey. In fact, more locally in Medford, New Jersey, The noted herbalist James Still, a free black man, built his first home without a masonry foundation before saving up enough money to buy additional land and erect a grander new home. In fact, his home was one of the largest in the town during the mid-19th century. The Cooper house measured about 17 feet by 38 feet in plan. This included the northern addition. It consisted of a main block as well as the addition. The main block may have contained 1 or 2 rooms with an overhead garret space, but no cellar below. Both the main part and the addition contained hearths. Still, the Coopers also chose to cook outdoors, perhaps during special events like pig roasts. The family's possessions may have been few, including only the most basic necessities. No mirror glass was found, and no leather or cloth-bound furniture with brass tack decorations appears to have been kept. So we didn't find any of those tacks that we would normally find on sites that reveal the type of furniture that was kept. Glass beads were found that indicate some bodily adornment was practiced by the Coopers. And several coat and pant buttons were also recovered, which are shown here. A single child's thimble found provided evidence that children or adolescents were needed to assist in household sewing chores or outwork that brought in additional funds. Sewing with a younger person allowed Nanny time to socialize, pass down skills, and form bonds with kin as stories, memories, and know-how were shared. Evidence also indicates that the Coopers owned firearms, as evidenced by some of the gun flints and lead shot that we found. The Coopers' firearms were probably used for hunting, for keeping at bay predators who were trying to eat livestock, and possibly even to ward off and protect themselves against white violence. And it's important to know too that so the site was occupied up until 1820s, but in 1831, Delaware passed a law that said that African Americans, both free and enslaved, were banned from owning guns. And this is after the Nat Turner Rebellion occurred in Maryland, when white society in Delaware was nervous about an uprising of African Americans. So they instituted legal restrictions on individuals' freedom as a result. And had this site been occupied after the 1830s, we likely would not have found gun flints unless the guns were hidden. So it's just an important note. Due to poor preservation at the site, we can't say much about diet. Few bones were found, and those that were found were largely restricted to the home's southern hearth. Sumac, a spice used to enhance food flavor, however, was found in the home's hearth, indicating its use. Vessel fragments shed light on food service and preparation, even if information on diet is lacking. Collectively, 29 glass and 126 ceramic vessels are represented in the assemblage. Glasswares included small and large bottles, vials, and 2 possible stemware cups. Compared to other contemporary sites in the Delaware Valley, particularly those occupied by white occupants, the Coopers had a larger percentage of white glasswares than those found in other farmsteads. This could be because Richard lacked an orchard where he could press his own apples and store his cider into casks. Instead, he may have required storage of liquids into smaller batches within bottles. This difference may have also been born from a difference in cultural expressions that the Coopers had learned and engaged in earlier on in their lives. The ceramics were dominated by refined table and teawares, over that of coarse earthenwares like redware, a pattern reminiscent of sites found in urban areas, but uncommon on rural sites in the area. The family only owned a few ceramic pans for storing milk and preparing food. However, such vessels may have been made out of wood, and if so, the use of wooden trenchers, containers, or bowls that no longer survive could result in a misreading of this data. Plates found include creamware with royal and feather edge rims, pearlware with shell edge rims, a single porcelain plate. The settings reflect the Cooper's spending power, needs, and personal aesthetic. The plate type assortment suggests an attempt to purchase some sets. Several redware chargers were also found, used for preparing foods, serving, trivet cooking, and baking. Fragments of 15 small bowls were identified that were used to serve soups, gruels, stews, and porridges. The evidence indicates that communally prepared and portioned servings were an important part of the family's diet. Teawares were quite abundant and may have been overstocked. These were commonly and contemporaneously less popular, older styles, perhaps purchased from estate sales, gifted by others, or they may have even been items brought to the site that the Coopers had purchased while enslaved and just brought to the site for their use. Several were also of a poor manufacture and may have been classified as manufacturing seconds, suggesting a level of thrift or limited spending power among the family. The quantity of teaware suggests the Coopers' desire to signal status and cultural refinement to guests who visited the site. Regardless, one can imagine Nanny and Richard taking tea to discuss religion, politics, news, and business with other family members or friends who came to visit, or to work out differences between community members within their home. The Coopers' teawares likely offered a splash of color and art in the home, particularly if displayed on open cupboards or shelves. Perhaps the teaware served as much for adornment as they did for function. In addition to the showier pieces, the Coopers also owned 2 low-fired, undecorated, and unglazed earthenware colonoware vessels, fragments of which you can see in this slide, as well as 1 kiln-fired, wheel-thrown jug or jar-like colonoware vessel. This latter vessel appears to have been overfired and may be similar to Barbadian redware, with a gray paste that was likely produced in Barbados, Jamaica, or Santo Domingo, and imported to Delaware market before being acquired by the Coopers. Wheel-thrown pottery predominated among local coarse earthenwares in Barbados, which did not develop an African-influenced tradition of pottery making. Instead, enslaved laborers tended to produce European pottery forms like sugar molds and molasses drip jars for the local industry. The other colonoware fragments from the site may have been made in the more southern mid-Atlantic region or the American Southeast by enslaved populations or by Native Americans. Such wares were less frequently found in Delaware. Local craft production of American colonoware served as a substitute for industrially produced imported European ceramics that enslavers may not have provided to their captive workers. As a result, large slave populations on plantations, particularly those in and north of Maryland, in and south of Maryland, were forced to produce their own ceramic containers. Use of colonoware by the Coopers household also reveals connection to a non-local southern production market. Caribbean imported ware may have served as a nostalgic reminder to Richard of his Caribbean birthplace and of his parents from whom he was taken at age 12 or 14. The vessels may have also been perfectly acceptable, but a less expensive alternative to other locally available earthenwares, and certainly would have been recognizable to other former enslaved workers in the community. Here, Richard and Annie combined elements of cultural behavior learned during enslavement into their life at the farmstead, as they had greater liberty to define themselves in ways that best reflected their own desired lifestyle. Perhaps the colonoware was among the few items and belongings brought to the site when the Coopers were released from bondage, reflecting their transition from enslavement to freedom. The family, or at least one member, also sought to diverge from Quaker practices. While excavating the hearth in the main block of the house, archaeologists found a small cache or deposit of artifacts in a post hole below the chimney, suggesting the material was placed in the hole when the house was constructed. So here's a plan view of the southern hearth. We have a post hole here. We have a post hole here as well, and the stain from the post. It's in this location where we had this artifact cache. And here we had burning soil. We had a lot of little bits of calcined bone and crushed bone. We also had a little pocket of bone in this area. Here's the excavation plan view of one of the bisects. So you can see one structural post here. There's another post and post hole here. We had this cache in this location. We had a small pocket of bone in this location here. And here's one of our archaeologists excavating the cache. Here are some of the items that were recovered, some fire-cracked rock and a pipe stem, as well as some of the bone that was recovered from this cache. Here are the artifacts that were identified in the cache. The items include 4 upper neck vertebrae from a cow, and these are the portions of the vertebrae that allow the cow skull to pivot, a faceted glass seed bead, tobacco pipe stems, a pewter button, and 4 pieces of fire-reddened rock. The rocks consist of fractured hearth or boiling stones, likely once used and discarded by pre-contact period Native Americans who once lived on the landscape. The Coopers later collected these stones, or these early hearthstones, and incorporated them into their artifact deposit. It's important to note that we didn't have these stones anywhere else. So it wasn't, we didn't have a situation where the Coopers had built this hearth, lined it with stone cobbles in order to use as a footing to bake off of or to cook off of. Instead, we just had this as a discrete deposit within a post hole, and it wouldn't have been visible to anybody in the house. It's unclear who among the Coopers created this cache. It's possible the discrete deposit may have served to acknowledge the power of ancestors, ward off unwanted spirits, or protect or bless the home. Certainly, caches found in the homes of white residents in the Northeast region have also been identified. In fact, these are more prevalent than those associated with African Americans that have been found. Within the homes of white residents, it's often found that shoes are hidden behind walls next to chimney stacks. Such caches allow users some semblance of control over their lives, just as one's faith offers solace in spiritual protection. Placement of concealed items in, below, and near hearths and other locations within dwellings to aid and protect was certainly common among both Black and white residents in the Northeast during the 18th through the early 20th century. However, caches in their composition, that is, the artifacts that physically compose the deposit, had very different meanings depending upon time, place, and cultural influences involved. What is unclear about the Coopers' deposit is exactly how they used it, largely because we don't know about Nanny's parentage or who the couple was influenced by as they were trafficked from region to region before being forced to work for the Hansons in central Delaware. For Richard, this meant multiple relocations from the Caribbean up the Atlantic coast and exposure to numerous individuals with different cultural backgrounds and who likely engaged in different religious practices. Certainly, the Quakers shunned iconography and items of superstition, along with items that could be empowered and used to protect. But really, who was to know about this cache? The cache was hidden below the house, and after being brutally oppressed for decades, the couple may have just sought what they could for some added assistance in life, in particular protection from malice by white society, in addition to all the other aspects that they practiced in their everyday lives. The cache also suggests the Cooper family members engaged in various traditions rather than adhering singularly to binding dogmatic principles. This fluidity allowed the Coopers to adapt in preferred ways that best suited family members' desired religious beliefs. Taken together, the hearth cache, the built landscape, ceramics and glass, yard space, they all clearly highlight how Cooper family members use space and material culture to signal their identity and exert control over their lives, even when their personal authority was undermined in the outside world. The data also reveals that Coopers were conscious decision makers in the social and cultural negotiation for control access, economic gains, and the ways they socially networked. Ultimately, this site showcases how the Coopers improvised and overcame obstacles, but continued to engage in resilient practices family members had early adopted in their life. In closing, I'd like to thank everyone who was involved in this study, which you can see here. And I'd also like to indicate for those interested that there's a wide selection of books that really helps researchers understand African American life in this region. It was particularly important to look at this material for this site because we're lacking that firsthand account by Richard, Nanny, and their children about what their lives were like. And instead, we have a white interpretation of who they were and what their lives were like. So it was necessary to turn to an assortment of firsthand narratives written by others in the region from the late 18th century all the way up to the late 19th century to better understand what life was like for both enslaved and free African Americans in the region. And I want to thank the Archaeological Society for allowing me to present today, and thank you for spending this time with me for this presentation.